So this somewhat relates to my last video, and we're talking about empires. Um, this is a subject that you will find a degree of bias on, depending on the source, but the facts are the only thing that matters when we're looking at the scale of empires. And empires can be sort of looked at in various ways, but the most important thing is judging the greatest extent of a territorial landmass, that is the territory controlled by a particular power at its peak, at the purported zenith of its power. So that's the key issue here, because some empires lasted a lot longer than others, but they had points where they were relatively weak or being weakened by civil war or civil strife. This was the case, of course, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, where you had schism between East and West. And of course, the East became the Byzantine Empire. In the West, we saw the crumbling of the Roman Empire, including up here at the edge of the Roman world. Um, but I think it's important that people just know what the data is as to what the largest empires were. Now, the largest empires all had a significant role on world history. You might argue I'm biased, but I would argue none so to the extent of the British Empire, at least in modern times. In the ancient world, I would say the Mongol Empire probably had the biggest significance. One could argue, notwithstanding the extreme bloodshed that was spilt in Mongol conquests, one could argue the Christian world almost had the Mongols to thank for keeping the Muslim sultanates in check. But this was a ruthless time when warlords ruled the world. Um, but anyway, without further ado, I just want to actually point out what the statistics are for the largest empires, and we're going to look at the top 10. The source here is Wikipedia, but you can find this in other sources as well. And going down from the top 10. So, the 10th largest empire in history, and this is looking at its peak, was the Xiongnu Empire. The Xiongnu was a sort of nomadic tribe that occupied the Asian steppe, which would later be the Mongols, the land occupied by the Mongols. In 176 BC, this is coinciding with sort of the Han Dynasty in China. They covered an area of about 9 million square kilometers. So they were the 10th largest empire in history by territorial landmass. The Yuan Dynasty, which had some Mongol descent, occupied China, and around 1320 they covered an area of up to 13 million square kilometers, although the lower figure suggests 11 million square kilometers. Huge empire. The Umayyad Caliphate, this is Islamic Caliphate that covered the Iberian Peninsula, most of North Africa, and most of the Middle East. In the year 720, it covered an area of around 11.1 million square kilometers. Tied with that, the Abbasid Caliphate. Slightly later, in the year 750, it occupied about 11.1 million square kilometers. So they were similar in size, and they were actually a similar area. The Abbasid Caliphate was more concentrated on the Arabian Peninsula. Second French colonial empire. So this is the French Empire that also included French Indochina and large chunks of Africa. So the Second French colonial empire in about 1920 covered around 11.5 million square kilometers, which at the time made it the second largest European empire. Then we come to the Qing Dynasty China, which was the last Chinese dynasty before China became a republic. Between about 1790 and 1820, the Qing dynasty covered roughly 13 million square kilometers. So it was a powerful empire, however, it was largely weakened in its last decades. One reason for this was the Taiping Rebellion, which by some accounts is the bloodiest civil war in history. Around 20 to 25 million people died in the Taiping Rebellion of the 1860s. It greatly weakened the Qing dynasty, and of course, this marked a century of humiliation for China. That is why many Chinese look at the Qing with disdain. A lot of Han Chinese actually see the Ming Dynasty as the last true dynasty of China. They sort of see the Qing Dynasty as an embarrassment. Of course, they weren't ethnic Hans. They were Manchus from the northeast. The Spanish Empire, the mighty Spanish Empire. In 1810, now this is actually later than I would have expected its peak, but in 1810, that coincides with the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish Empire covered some 13.7 million square kilometers, which was a huge, huge area. Of course, Spain had a massive influence in the New World in the Americas, covering much of the New World except for Brazil um, and the British part of the United States. Well, originally English, of course, the 13 colonies. The vast Russian Empire is third place. Um, in 1895, this is the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, excuse me. Vast, vast swathe of land, one of the last powers to have serfdom. Um, some 22.8 million square kilometers. Vast, vast area. Just to put that in context, Russia today, the Russian Federation covers around 17 million square kilometers. So it was significantly bigger than the Russian Federation is today, a vast area. And as such, it was particularly difficult to govern, which explained the number of peasant revolts throughout its history. So 1895, the Russian Empire covered about 22.8 million square kilometers. Now we come to the Mongol Empire, which was actually the largest empire that was a contiguous empire. Now, this is very important when people talk about the number one spot. The Mongol Empire was actually the largest empire in terms of a contiguous area, that is, from one side to the other. So it stretched everywhere from Japan to the Near East. Vast, vast area. And at its peak in around the year 1300, this was actually after Genghis Khan. This would have been one of the successors, I believe, around the time of Kublai Khan. The Mongol Empire covered some 24 million square kilometers. Vast, vast, vast empire. Then we come to number one spot. Without question, by far, the British Empire. Now, people will say I'm biased, but the expression the sun never set on the British Empire was literal. It was absolutely literal because if you woke up in New Zealand and it was morning, and you went to sleep in Great Britain or in Canada, it was night. So the British Empire, sun literally never set. Now, the same thing was said about the Spanish and Portuguese empires, but the Spanish didn't have much of a foothold in Asia. Um, the Portuguese at their peak were sizable, but nowhere near that size. So I really don't think we can underestimate sheer size and the influence of the British Empire. The only thing with the British Empire was it was relatively short as empires go. If we, and it can be divided into two periods, the first British Empire, starting roughly in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and the Second British Empire from 7 Years' War onwards to arguably the handover of Hong Kong. The handover of Hong Kong in 1997 is generally seen as the end of the British Empire. But its peak was not actually in Queen Victoria's reign, it was slightly later in King George V's reign, just after the First World War. Um, Absolutely vast, 35.5 million square kilometers. This was about 26% of the entire world. Vast. But it wasn't just the sheer size of the British Empire, it was also the influence. All these videos exploring the biggest empires, one thing is noticeable. The comments are in English. Now, if this is not a sign of the influence of the British Empire, I don't know what is. And I'm not going to deny, as a Briton, I do have some pride with this. Now, I'm not jingoistic. I'm not sort of like, oh, we conquered the world and everyone should admire us. We done some terrible things. There was exploitation, there were massacres, as there were in every empire. But I frankly think that if it's okay for the Mongols to be proud of their hegemony, if it's okay for other cultures and powers to be proud of the times that they were at the top, I don't see why we British should constantly bow our heads in shame. I think we should acknowledge there was exploitation. I think we should acknowledge there was racism. I think we should acknowledge there were atrocities. But I contend that every power given half a chance would have done the same thing, and history shows this. So it's very, very important to look at empires in the context of other empires. And if you're going to judge the British empires and all the terrible things that happened, compare it to the Belgians, compare it to the Spanish, compare it to Imperial China, compare it to the Mongols, compare it to the Romans. Incidentally, there are some famous empires that are actually quite far down the list. For example, by the way, 11 and 12 position, the Empire of Brazil in 1889, about 8.3 million square kilometers. The Empire of Japan, which of course coincided with the Second Sino-Japanese War, covered some 7.4 to 8.51 million square kilometers. Now going down, the Achaemenid Persian Empire covered about 5.5 million square kilometers around 500 BC. So it's one of the more famous ones, but it's actually relatively far down the list. And the Tang Dynasty, between 5.4 and 10.7 million square kilometers, a big discrepancy there. The Tang Dynasty was shattered by a major, major revolt, the Yan Lushan Rebellion of the 8th century, which was a very, very bloody rebellion. The Roman Empire, the famous Roman Empire, certainly among the more famous empires, because it lasted so long, it lasted for centuries. In about the year 117, so the early second century, about a century after the crucifixion, the Roman Empire covered around 5 million square kilometers. Huge, but actually, if we look at de facto terms, that ranks around 25th in terms of actual size. So as famous as it is, it wasn't even in the top 10 in terms of size. The thing with the Roman Empire, I think, was its influence on the modern world and on democracy. The British, of course, were largely influenced by Rome. If you look at, for example, Victorian art, you can even see this today. There is a heavily influence where, I mean, if you look at British portraits from the 18th century, very often generals and politicians styled themselves almost like Roman emperors, and the busts would be made just in that style. We also had follies made in the 19th and 18th centuries, which were designed like structures of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. An example is actually near my city. It's called the Penshaw Monument. It was built in 1847, but it looks like an old Roman or Greek Pantheon type structure, or Acropolis, thinking of ancient Greece. So that's just interesting to know. So, whatever way you look at it, the British Empire was the largest in total area, and yes, the Mongol Empire was the largest in contiguous area. But if we're looking in actual area terms overall, none of them came close to the British Empire. That's just a fact. And yes, I'm British, but it's a fact, and it's a fact that can't be argued with when you actually look at the land area that was covered. Now, one could argue that the Mongols were more dominant in their day because the world population was a lot smaller and the known world was a lot smaller. Hence, proportionally speaking, the Mongols were perhaps the largest. But if it's a head to head between the British and the Mongols, the British covered a larger area. That's a fact. So I'll put a link under this so you can see the total figures.